Oh, there are credible threats on the president/S and on all leaders, and with Central Connecticut State University through administrations. They have collusions with FBI Director Robert Luskin and many ties to him and his co-defendants of his in the 2006 district court case in Connecticut. These are also roles with names on all sides of criminal and civil cases. And the court's names the intelligence tied to them, everyone attached to fake changed communications from off those locations. And it's collusion/S with names with all the countries in the news where they have pieced together syntax and where they, in other words, where they have roles with campuses, where they have roles with exceptions. They were our roles with exploitation/S of that by the human fact nature breaching method that has been replaced right from the communications of America's founders simultaneously and of nature itself. So there are other natures and methods of organized crime in particular. There were roles originally instilled with methods of organized crimes. For example, I'm not a lawyer. Lawyers on all sides of criminal and civil cases. And you know, the interbranch of the intelligence tied to them, they could be, we could discern, they could be and were criminally foreign influence / hyper-criminally foreign influence at the same time. They could be and were and are collusion still /S making the subject treatments of witch trials apart from what our founders communicated, left declassified for themselves and for us about why and how they did not have free speech, for example. About why, communicating about, which is distinct from saying, about why and how. There's a witch trial place next to Webb House, now renamed the Webb Stevens Museum. There are only 3 branches of government at countries A through Z. A hyper-foreign name is juxtaposed here, where we are syntax as function, forced by nature, but now as by nature through systems of tactical terror that increasingly can't afford to discern how nature's identity, its identity in relation to itself, and the only increasing value of that is what is being shown to us generates all grouped differences relative to there being an individual species body of a whole bunch of individual bodies. And it is a different species, individual species body. And all the other species bodies are also individual species bodies of a whole bunch of individual bodies. Right, where and how and why nature shows us it is generating all differences, and why and how it is functional, being hyper invisible but still discernible distinctly from how it is also the body of what is invisible but still discernible. Just as your complete identity is the body of a hair on your head or the tip of your fingernail. While it is not, by any way. And what keeps that capable of being is how its volume is inseparable from all things, including anything that can be made up like art. And it shows us this. It also shows us, you know, relatively to our short words, let alone their protraction, because it shows that it uses our short words grouped and simultaneous. Where how it is functional, that there is a distinct identity of value, so it's variable regression. That is no other system, but as its own, and with all exceptions, exception nature itself too, with demonstration /S of the same thing. And so we could all individually go against that. We all agreed to go against it. It would still demonstrate with negative value nature progressions, acts and natures. Excuse me for one moment. Yes. In the dryer. Okay, I'm sorry. So what we have to understand, it's a torture, extortion, in fact, should be nature slavery method. But to check to make sure that we're in other words, it's also simultaneously an identity theft, fraud, slander method and style that is maintenance to have one else defend in their subject treatments, for example, defenses of logic and nature and or nature of logic and or the difference, collusion / S, that forces self-valued criminally foreign influence / hyper-criminally foreign influence. No. Because this breaching method needs names A through Z of countries that could only be operated by locations, areas, and states. To blame what the hyper-foreign did and maintains, done, against every individual human difference, every grouped human difference, and every simultaneous one, every voicing of humanity. Since before modern religious messengers were born, thank God, per God function, this is per the pantheism method. And I'm I'm declass. I should keep this a secret. It's for hyper programming. But if you could end world wars, right through world wars, there were collusion / there was collusion / S. There were collusions, plural, that were singularly collusion with a human fact, human nature breaching method. That is one of the things that all the distinct identities of multi-front attacks and helping and or helping roles where and how it was his manifest relativity, where and how there were subject treatments and are still subject treatments that could not and cannot defend their roles with the logic, nature of logic, that, and or with the exceptions, value treatments, or the special value treatments that could not defend their styles, nature, logic with that at the same time, afford to be, let alone to protract short words as they are actually capable with convictions, for example, even with or without blame involved. Let alone blame leaving out the roles of the human fact, human nature breaching method. That is also hyper-evidentially recorded as a scientific value, effectively measured and maintained, with all roles for the breaching method, self-valued and self-valuing roles, with other communicators for James Madison for nature itself, regarding how and why everyone had stayed roles and had roles with a human fact, human nature breaching method to have reassigned what nature communicates with black people's whites of eyes, which is distinct from, but non-distinct from what it is communicating. Where and how it is communicating, there are a whole bunch of different individual species bodies, and each of them is made up by a whole bunch of individual bodies of that individual body. And their demonstration, nature demonstrates how its individual identity of value progression is generating this, and wants and needs us to understand this because we are it. But we are aware of how it is making more of itself. As even anything we make up, it is distinctly the finite details or the order of the finite as their value, not as their value, but why is it? And or the group details and the simultaneous, like with the subject, the parts of speech of English grammar, of the other languages, all things are about this. Like the subject, it's about the invisible but still discernible. All the parts of speech are about the invisible but still discernible. But they come with / the hyper invisible but still discernible. And for example, this is partially what the Trinity is about, per science. Jesus Christ and the Old Testament and other versions of it. Leaving out. See, forgiveness is to show where the breaching method is discernible. It is where guilt roles are. Simultaneously, where no one wanted, everyone has the self-valued roles anyway, and not realizing. Like with black people's whites of eyes. No one wants collusions with that. But everyone realizes that if they try to use that as hyper-evidential, the way nature tries to have us with our short words, even though our founders themselves, the only one we know the name of specifically is James Madison. But that and other things, nature itself shows us too, the names even of the Native Americans who didn't agree. But nature shows us too that there is a portion of them that agreed and helped James Madison and the colonists behind him, which were not enough, even with James Madison and George Washington. There are proofs that everyone was counter-extorted with James Madison's plan. And then they went and got George Washington. I mean, that was the plan, to get George Washington to help them. In other words, there are proofs that George Washington was counter-extorted too. But we can't even have a logic argument about this. Also, as evidence, because George Washington himself, he said that he was extorted. We're supposed to be honest about his extortion and allow people to be honest about his extortion. And to be honest about the difference of that, how it was and is exploited. A breaching method knew that. It's one of the things that would be demonstrated to the people, A through Z, at locations, areas, and states, everywhere the human species body has a body standing. Hyper-criminal foreign influences would be demonstrated. But it also figured out a way to make all roles self-valued without even realizing, having blamed nature's demonstrations of the hyper-criminally foreign influences and use/S, collusion/S of them roles, self-valued, and or sensing anyone with short words proper before they're allowed to retract, and self-valuing to get away with it. Realizing it or not, even when realizing, only to an extent, understanding how that is dependent upon the rules of predicate acts with facts, acts and methods, with names, the difference of guilt at or next to the campuses of all ages and natures, and or at corners of streets there. At the same time, increasingly with layers of foreign bodies, like criminal enterprises, private, overt, terrorists, time collusion/S. Oh, but we hate each other. We try to prosecute them. Oh, in other words, we hate them. They prosecute. The jails too. Well, we hate them. We jail them. They're hiding the same criminally time collusion/S with use/S of their same sequences, of their same predicate acts with facts. Evidence is racketeering worse than war crimes. All exception nature collusion, like truths about it that show other. All that used in demonstration/S of the same. Forgiveness is because each nature of difference, even the differences of the branches of government, at countries A through Z, their guilt individually grouped and together. A breaching method propagated defenses, self-value, without even right where no one self-values it in relative ways, though, because no one's discerning. They need to hide live aggressions from those locations, at those locations. And the differences of the guilt there, collusion/S there or there. All natures of crime scenes. It is critical to understand where and how they act and have collusion/S. Connecticut corrections officers and judicial branch officers and conjunctions to it and to that, like Weathersfield Pizza House has wire crimes, identity thefts, and frauds with the FBI, Robert Luskin, and others involved with with Connecticut campuses, intrust cities, and people and the leaders of them, and or their kids. The difference of the guilt of that with their roles with the predicate acts with facts, specifically as a method that keeps other things, others, ourselves, self-value, self-value rules, forcing that to be blamed, right? And how it's gotten away with relative to right where and how. Replaced right from nature's communication. Nature shows us in our founders' communications. There's a human fact, human nature breaching method that reassigned black people's rights of eyes, communications by nature, which also communicates its only nature. Some things are only natural as criminal insidiousness. But to address the problems with criminal insidiousness natures of positive treatments and negative treatments, exceptions and a special difference in relativity. We have black people's whites of eyes. We are an individual species body made up of a whole bunch of individuals. We have the same color eyes and different color eyes at the same time. We are a different species body than other different species bodies. Nature is and has been demonstrating to us. It projects to us what difference / hyperdifference is about, what relativity is about / hyperrelativity, because it is what is not our species body, is not those species bodies, but it's all things anyway. And then further, it's all, not only is it all species bodies, but while as itself distinctly from how the rest of itself is itself, which is a trinity per science, of how to describe, which all descriptions are the invisible but still discernible. How there is with this individual identity of hyper-invisible but still discernible value progression is discernible. It comes simultaneously with the parts of the rest of itself manifest hyper additionally with and as this value, where value equals value as nature / nature as value, and nature as value / value as nature, where it is a sequence / simultaneous nature / hyper simultaneous nature. Unlike all others, it shows us that we are a distinct species body from the other species bodies. But as species bodies, we're also non-distinct. And we are also simultaneous, but per an identity of value progression that is a further distinct identity of simultaneous nature, while not, in any way, so we could discern where and how it is also functional, being hyper invisible distinctly, but still discernible distinctly from how it is invisible but still discernible, and how the individual identities, parts of itself are. For example, you could discern the body of the seasons before they get here, because you have already been shown this. But you have been shocked and awe at countries A through Z regarding, how to describe our founders and why and how. The only one we know the name of that was in agreement with that, as that group, is James Madison. And that plan of George Washington used, he came to the founding locations with the other founders. James Madison's plan to force everyone to break the rules of the internationally monitored conversations of the overt criminal enterprises, the private ones, the terrorists, all only capable of being manifested at the time. This breaching method uses the identities of relativity / relativities to ourselves through all identities of sophistication. that were timed collusions with all opposite at the same time. Self-valued roles with hyperforeign and or sensing for it. And this is also relative to why and to how Little Rap Guy and Friends cartoons are counter-obfuscated, also per the impositions of time, where how the screeching method prevents us short words, and then wants and needs to have a debate about their title's worth, dishonestly, criminally foreign influenced, / hyper-criminally foreign influenced, and tactically delusions wrong. Boxing is fought by the rules, but the rules have been abridged since / hyper-abridged since them ancient times. Specifically, where how it propagated only allowed roles with identities of integrity reliant upon other things, others, or selves being and having been blamed for things that nature itself and that our founders themselves. Again, the only one we know the name of is James Madison, but they had communications with him about how they didn't even have free speech. Even when James Madison was a president, he still didn't have free speech because it was a breaching method entrenched. It was a hyper-foreign breaching method. But the identities, the names of the people, the sciences, the identities of the people, the groupthink, it was only capable of subject treatments and roles with fact, cheap nature, quality aspects of nature, and defenses of that could not and cannot afford to have short words of anyone proper regarding the collusion / S recorded relative there. Everywhere, the species body has an individual body standing. A hyper-additional name from A through Z is multi-front against the individual voice of any leader, no matter how powerful they could get. They could only be above locations, areas, and states that have only remembered humanity, blaming other things, others, or selves for really how and for really why. For things, a breaching method that's not names A through Z did. To force the only people could operate the names A through Z, to have to respond to things syntactically, where no one could have done it properly because no one understood what was happening. There are proofs that criminal enterprises in different countries realized at the same time they were going to get caught, how they could do tricks and get others themselves blamed for things, and then to use that to get away with things, to keep nature's demonstrations from being the way it would increasingly demonstrate too, because then would demonstrate that too, and they knew that too, so they had a plan then to cover that up too, through other people then would defend their roles, counter each other, and everyone not realizing increasingly they are self-valuing. They were and are self-valuing uses of the names of the people of sciences and or of the identity of value progression the sciences share, while not by any way its way / S. But again, we are prevented short words regarding it. We have black pupils' whites of eyes. And even though we've had sabotaged education at campuses A through Z, sickly distinctly, while sickly non-distinctly, and other things, others ourselves, we're blamed and are forced to be blamed, to pretend other, where collusion / S with that stand. See, that is right and we're until exceptions are made real. And everyone is using those truths for lies. Even their motivations, their kids. This breaching method abused you guys in ways you couldn't fathom. Where it has the difference between the guilt of the kids or the adults of overt criminal enterprises, private ones, terrorists, all the countries really here, A through Z, how they are shared here. In other words, adult, kid, positive, negative treatments, identity treatments, has been, again, through systems and as systems, tactical terror from its own. And this is relative to where and to how. There are and have been collusions, only 3 branches of government. And the breaching method knew that the collusions of all differences would be manifest. And nature would be demonstrating to people that are not of that difference and those differences. But if they try to voice it, they'd be sensed. I'm not saying that they're not victims, they don't have excuses, motivations that they're being honest about. But right where everyone's being honest about their motivations, you are simultaneously being honest, dishonest, like with black people's whites of eyes. You know, where and how none let one rise. With this as the hyper-evidential. We long to speak and have spoken for ourselves, individually grouped together. We long to have addressed what everyone missed, like, for example, distinct natures of organized crimes and of organized crimes groups and of distinct natures of criminal foreign influence and predicate acts with facts, methods, /S roles. That research and that polling campuses have and have had. The campuses training all natures of police forms, all natures of courts, roles with courts, all natures of prisons, roles with prisons, all exceptions, exception nature, all differences at or next to all locations and name. Effectively exploited by a breaching method, recorded gold. How they get away with it is also recorded. We have to use the phenomenon of technology right, properly. See, the companies are forced to rely upon intelligence that tells them what was actually recorded. And of how they make mistakes too. They exploit that too, just to hide the collusion. That they have collusions playing. In other words, please, Facebook, I'll sign that I won't sue you guys. I just need the people involved with the ad placements. But involved in New Britain Superior Court's Facebook page, people, and the positions with the court involved. Also with Wethersfield Police Facebook page. And the Facebook pages of the campuses further involved with the principal child offenders and changing and faking digital evidences with whiting forensics, increasingly involved with a bunch of names involved with identity theft, fraud, slanders acts from other areas on my street since I was a kid, whiting forensics, and foreign and domestic, how they're actually shared here and there with the campuses. Central Connecticut State University has credible threats roles with the campuses in their cities, and with names on the corrections offices and judicial branch offices involved with abuses of kids, leaders first forced years apart, and more then and now. And as ones and families that had time collusions with youth /S of elderly homes, and clearer than day, why and how really the Veterans Affairs buildings look just like those buildings in the background in some of the best rap videos is recorded, but we have replaced what our founders communicated for themselves and for James Madison. Like about how why James Madison didn't have free speech. There were a list of reasons that were generated by the breaching method. That again is also a scientific value because it's one of the human fact-checking nature breaching method is one of the things that all those distinct natures of laws against every human difference were together the same way valued as. They were valued as a human fact-checking. What were they about? What were witch trials about? What were Jim Crow laws about? a human fact-keeping nature breaching method. But what were the counters about? The same thing. Oh, but there are worse, of course. Because we're not addressing the breaching methods, torture, extortion, and fact-keeping nature slavery method that designed the suburbs, northern colonies, and southern colonies denatured, let alone the cities. Anyone wants to deny that they don't, or pretend they can't believe that the urban, the suburban / urban, and the suburban, even the rural, even the jungle, all is a landscape theater tactical nature system / as tactical terrier from nature system, and roles with all exceptions, plural, and demonstration of the same thing, that one identity of hyper-volume. Science, inseparable from all of the things, well, not by any way. Part of how it shows us its three identities of relationship to itself. Juxtaposed with matter. And relativity of a special difference here, not just at Earth, but in demonstration of competence with the rest of its course in communications, finite, grouped, and simultaneous / hyper simultaneous. You guys won't allow the quality factor. Then you have the hide, pretend other. Well, that was my motivation. They told me we took an oath. In other words, please, you guys came through 6 campuses. In other words, increasing the difference of the guilt of names at the campuses next to it, or relative to corners and exceptions relative. Or in other words, WFSB has rules and reports along Route 3, the stories, with the sources of WTNH and Fox Connecticut News, increasingly Collusion / S, with a whole bunch of other countries, and former director of the FBI, Robert Luskin, and his co-defendants, their family members, involved on off campuses with differences, rackets, with all the countries in the news. Because a certain type of victim / hyper victim needs to respond properly, and they need to yell or whatever. That's all they understand, because there's a quality of fact-keeping nature that everyone has self-valued roles with, not just criminal foreign influences or criminal insidious nature. I'm not a lawyer, but is it hyper / hyper criminally foreign influence / hyper criminal insidiousness nature? But right where and how everyone is the victim together. And those guilt roles through our own were assigned, but a breaching method maintains it. Everyone wants to be treated like a victim, though. One's need not to start the nature debate and force the nature debate in such a way where we're forced to demonstrate their criminal involvement, leaving out the breaching method. That's one of the reasons why the breaching method needs to maintain self-valued roles at campuses, with the differences of the guilt at the campuses, or with the names from off the campuses as our own, or the overt criminal enterprise, private ones, terrorists, as our own as intelligence too, like the difference of their guilt, keeping life aggressions tied to database relativity / relativity to ourselves, and then further collusion / hyper additionally at campuses and relative to exceptions, and relative to where and to how multi-front. This breaching method maintains self-valued roles with short words for the difference / differences of each agent and nature of fact-keeping nature. Exactly the way it needs to keep, gotten away with. to keep in self-valued roles perpetrating against our own multi-front. It's a perpetration against the kids, like of New York City and or of the suburbs. See, multi-front, the suburbs in New York City are distinctly, but non-distinctly too. They are hyper criminally foreign influence, tactically denatured / hyper denatured. Exactly the way the breaching method needed to have nature demonstrate increasingly with negative value nature progressions, acts, and natures. That the breaching method effectively employed nature's demonstrations, its actual demonstrations. It employed those things and it maintains them effectively, used to blame other things, others, or selves. Exactly the way the breaching method needs, as collusion / S, where and how it was building upon everyone blaming other things, others, or selves, for what it caused past, active, and to come, and with perspectives of what's to come, like all because it's negotiations and it's positive relative to war. In other words, shock and awe at A through Z. Here Anthony vaccine. So increasingly, Weathersfield police have wire crime acts and methods in foreign and domestic countries, and a whole bunch of people tied to Weathersfield Pizza House with a Steven Stacco involved with a bunch of people and his educators at Central Connecticut State University, involved with unauthorized judicial branch officer with Weathersfield police with wire crime acts and methods. I don't know what he said to them, but he's been planting evidences and collusion / S, increasingly with his educators and his conversations with them, as collusion / S with people from off the campuses and people from other countries. I never saw Maria Pazina on a Weathersfield campus in my life. Her neighbors were increasingly like a Brian Bonin, recorded, confessed, demonstrate, confirmed, involved with more people involved with child abuses and roles with agencies, foreign and domestic groups, and people involved with identity theft, fraud, slanders. I never saw him on the inside of a campus in my life either. I only know him involved with sequence ships and people planting cover-ups to illusions where they have roles with sequence shifts and identity theft, fraud, slanders, collusions, falsified police reports roles, wire crime acts and methods roles, and fake motivation screening by using real motivations too. The difference of that. Because one of the things that everyone has role, the breaching method knew that it has roles with the motivations of everyone. Where and how it knew that natures would demonstrate needs for the people, the scientists to say and to discern the different things and exceptions where they make convictions. Not just the people of the law. Also the difference of that collusion. In other words, the names of the people of the law are reliant upon the names of the experts of the American history. Their used self-valued roles at location / S, replacing what James Madison and our founders communicated, and or sensing anybody not doing that. And individually grouped in together the departments, the nature of the difference of the guilt there, or the sense and sensibilities of the people next to it, or temporary. And news at the same time. All communications locations, the same thing is manifest. The difference of the guilt there, or the intelligence next to them. Connecticut intelligence is forcing me to say these things so they can pretend other too, because they have been leaking about how they have roles with the names next to the difference of the guilt at the network locations or at locations next to them, names, or one's just temporary going by there. That difference is exploited where and how They make subject treatments exactly the way the breaching method needs and needed. Where how they make they have rules with complex resolutions. They have to show how where nature, this breaching method knew that nature itself will be demonstrating. Branches of government are manifest in ways other than we are allowed to appreciate. And the opposite is true simultaneously. And the cause/S of it, this breaching method needs other things, others, or ourselves to be and stay motivations. Right, where, and how. All there really was is roles with motivation/S. Like right, where, and how. Everyone's motivated, even to yourselves, to pretend that how we have black people's whites of eyes. How not even needing writing alone, not even needing writing, we could look right through and discern and understand. Readings of instances and repeating what is described about instances, all sides of them, including all sides of criminal and civil cases, and or the difference of that, their lawyers, the interbranch names, the names of the people, their defenses of the names of their titles, and their value. It was through and as systems tactical terrier from that value/value progression that none other could mimic. Otherwise, we sense. So this breaching method employed the names of the people of sciences to make confessions to itself in ways they wouldn't even realize, and to make confessions to ourselves for a function/S as the breaching method. Part of the breaching method's method is a use of all/S, of all location/S, and with database relativity/hyper relativity to ourselves replaced with the relativity of self-valued rules of the human fact, human nature, breaching method individually grouped in together. Even when you guys are shocked and awe and not realizing, when you're making subject say, "Oh, that's politics." Well, it's economics. Look, in other words, you guys are speaking about value nature systems, tactical terrier from its own, without allowing demonstration/S of use/S of that, of collusion/S and use/S of that, specifically behind nature's demonstrations of the rules of the breaching method with your motivation, preventing many, like myself, how we want the human species body of individual bodies, wants them to stop using the fake motivation. People who jump into our conversations when we speak about predicate acts and methods of them. Even if we're not lawyers, like myself, I'm not a lawyer. Especially lawyers originally, and still they have collusions that are evidence, hyper-evidential. We're going to have to formally define the hyper-evidential for ourselves. We're going to have formally forced a who disbelieves act because of use/S of the difference of collusion/S of our side's names, of other side's names, overt criminal enterprises, private ones at the same time, terrorists, styles, needs, natures of logic, kept at the same time, needing to cover up the same differences, rackets, so roles, and use/S of its syntactically nature-wise, being and having been. This is relative, really, why and how. The agencies countering overt criminal enterprises, private ones, insidiousness with borders, criminal foreign influence involved with borders, because they're hyper criminal foreign influences involved, but they already had self-valued roles with it. The police forms and their processes, their roles with the courts, the prisons, they have roles with all kinds of drugs and medicines crimes. And even the real motivations are used to screen the breaching methods roles with their motivations. Connecticut's corrections office and judicial branch offices have roles with identity theft, fraud, slanders methods with their families, acting as collusion/S with people putting fake transcripts, collusion/S at each campus and next to them, and or the differences of guilt. This was increasingly with the differences also of the state's criminality and sick things, or the federal. And this breaching method keeps them needing to counter each other, specifically for its needs for their motivations, defenses. Their needs for their defenses of fact, treating nature, quality aspects of nature. Exception nature, forbidding styles, needs, natures, but motivations, even the real ones. That's only allowed to be. This breaching method showed that the suits and ties named the people of sciences. They need to hide. A human fact treating nature breaching methods /S roles with really and why and how. They responded and or they were asked questions and or they asked questions. But then no one could afford that to discern. Not one has learned. Because one even allowed people to be honest about how a breaching method had reassigned what nature communicates with black people's whites of eyes as relativity /hyperrelativity. And then America's felons were born. It had already assigned all identities of integrity. Needs to defend that syntactically as styles forced by nature itself, for them to be with those defenses to be reliant upon criminally foreign influence /hypercriminally foreign influence, tactically delusions raw, readings of statutes, precedents, or reality of motivations, relativity to the scientific value of the breaching method that our founders actually communicated about, which comes with appreciating why and how. Why? They had the only name that they could let us know about that was definitely our founder was James Madison. And they did such in a way, knowing that other would be pretended for themselves. This is why we were directed to be honest about the extortion of George Washington. Therefore, allow others to be too. But you guys won't do that. I would have brought up James Madison's counter-extortion and George Madison's uses of their leverage and plan. James Madison's plan to help them counter-extort everyone else, to force them to break the laws that were involved, that were equivalent as fact, true nature, extortion, torture, and slavery of themselves anyway. And in other words, regardless of what their voices said, it was recorded. No one had free speech. Everyone had to pretend they had free speech to an extent /S other. Anyway, rather, they had to pretend they had free speech anyway to an extent. And that was measured and maintained. There were measured and maintained collusions, use /S of collusions with that were simultaneously even worse. Involved, damages from other things, others ourselves, forced, blamed, right, where, and how. That was what was being blamed. So not one has trained. And so this is relative to where and to how people need electricity. And we're on a tactically denatured basis at countries A through Z. Through and as systems tactical ulterior from how nature talks about positive and negative. And the nations with even, they don't know how to speak about all the ways they are forced to change, to hide things in details. And it's relativity where and how the breaching method keeps that quality of factory nature, criminally foreign influence / hypercriminally foreign influence. So, for example, we're going to examine where and how and why this breaching method maintains sides and counters to sides, saying or doing whatever to keep from discernment, what sickly non-distinctly had northern colonies and southern colonies hyper criminally foreign influence forced self-valued rules with human factory nature, torture, extortion, slavery method that was forced entrenched even upon our founders, pounding drums or not.